امين وافضل الصلاه واتم التسليم على سيدنا ونبينا محمد الذي ارسله الله سبحانه وتعالى رحمه ونورا وشفاء للعالمين. اللهم صل وسلم وبارك عليه وعلى اله واصحابه صلاه وسلاما دائمين متلازمين الى يوم الدين وعلى اله وصحبه وسلم تسليما كثيرا. Alhamdulillah. In this series of lessons we are looking at Maraqi al-Falah, Sharh Nur al-Idah, this compendium of the fiqh of worship by Imam Ash-Shurunbulali rahimahullah ta'ala, looking at the sections on fasting, zakat, and then Hajj bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. So we began last time by taking a madkhal, an introductory look at the fiqh of fasting and how there are two things. For fasting to be obligatory, you have to catch some part of the month of Ramadan of that which is fit for fasting, right? But then each day is a cause for the fasting of that day. So one does require an intention for each day. As we intuit, each day is a distinct day of fasting. So we fast the month of we're responsible for fasting the month of Ramadan, and each day is a distinct day that we are obligated with respect to fasting. So then we look at the ahkam of fasting, right? So he says, وهو فرض أداء وقضاء على من اجتمع فيه أربعة أشياء. Fasting, وهو أي صوم رمضان, fasting Ramadan is obligatory, right? And this is personally obligatory. أداء وقضاء, both in current performance, if you catch the month of Ramadan, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make us reach there, وقضاء, and making it up if missed, for one who completes four conditions. And هي شروط افتراضه والخطاب به. These are the conditions of it being obligatory for one and for the divine address to relate to one, as is clear from the verses on fasting, right? Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala makes exemptions. Firstly, He addresses the believers, right? And then He excludes the one who is sick or traveling or otherwise unable, right? وَتُسَمَّى شُرُوطَ وُجُوبٍ, right? These are called the conditions of obligation, right? These are the conditions of obligation. We'll then see the conditions of validity. What are they? الإسلام والعقل والبلوغ والعلم بالوجوب لمن أسلم بدار الحرب أو الكون بدار الإسلام. So there's four conditions for obligation: Islam, intellect, puberty, and knowing the obligation if one enters Islam in non-Muslim lands, distant from the Muslims, or living in the lands of Islam. Okay. أحدها الإسلام لأنه شرط للخطاب بفروع الشريعة. Right? The first condition is Islam, right? Because it's a condition for being addressed with the details of the Sharia. Right? There's discussion, and you can see that is there responsibility with respect to responsibility for non-Muslims with respect to the rulings of the Sharia, right? And of course, there's an agreed upon component, which is that in this life they're not held accountable for them, for the rulings of the Sharia, in such that, we don't command a non-Muslim to fast, we don't advise them to fast, specifically, except for like health consideration, whatever. Rather, as is clear from the hadith of Sayyidina Mu'adh radiallahu ta'ala anhu to Mu'adh, of the Sayyidina Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam to Sayyidina Mu'adh, may Allah be well pleased with him, that we call people first to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? And if they enter into Islam by believing in Allah and His Messenger, then we inform them of the duties. Because so are they held accountable for them in the hereafter? There are multiple opinions. You can see in Tahtawi the details regarding that, right? But practically for us, we don't hold them accountable in this life for these things. And it affects how we call people as well. We're not calling them to religious practice, we're calling them to belief, and belief entails religious practice, right? Like, we're not presenting Islam to people. And although it's become customary, we say the call to Islam, but call to Islam means call to submitting to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? To accepting Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then if you accept that, then you would accept His command. But calling them, well, we believe in this and this and this and this, that's poor marketing, right? Poor da'wah. وَثَانِيهَا الْعَقْلُ إِذْ لَا خِطَابَ بِدُونِهِ. The second of the conditions for obligation of the fasting is sanity, because there is no address without it. وَثَالِثُهَا الْبُلُوغ. The third is puberty. إِذْ لَا تَكْلِيفَ إِلَّا بِهِ. Because there is no moral responsibility without it, without bulugh. But as we've taken with prayer, as we've taken with other rulings, even wudu, etc., that the 7-year-old is encouraged to perform these duties with increasing degree of encouragement, and the 10-year-old is expected to do it so that they are prepared once morally responsible. Right? وَرَابِعُهَا الْعِلْمُ بِالْوُجُوبِ. The fourth, and this is a sensitive one, so pay attention. الْعِلْمُ بِالْوُجُوبِ. Knowing that this is an obligation. وَهُوَ شَرْطٌ لِمَنْ أَسْلَمَ بِدَارِ الْحَرْبِ. This is a condition for someone who entered Islam in enemy lands. Right? وَإِنَّمَا يَحْصُلُ لَهُ الْعِلْمُ you have بالوجوب or بالموجب؟ بال إنما يحصل له العلم الموجب, and one only acquires the knowledge that makes it incumbent upon one بإخبار رجلين عدلين. If two upright people tell you that fasting is obligatory for you once you become Muslim. أو رجل وامرأتين, or a man and two women. مستورين, if you don't know their state. أو واحد عدل, or another opinion is one upright person is sufficient. This is according to Imam Abu Hanifa. وعندهما, and according to Abu Hanifa's two main students, لا تشترط العدالة, that uprightness is not required. ولا البلوغ, right? Nor in puberty, meaning in the one who informed you that as a Muslim you must fast. So someone became Muslim and a young child, a discerning child, let's say, told him, brother, you have to fast. Then the reasoning being that وَلَا الْحُرِّيَّةِ, nor being free. Why? So that, because if you entered Islam and you don't know its rulings and someone tells you that this is obligatory, then you have a duty to find out. So what's meant by Dar al-Islam, of course, is an enemy land, right? Where you're far away from the Muslims, and you don't have a means of learning, right? So أو الكون شرط لمن نشأ بدار الإسلام, or just growing up in Muslim lands, right? فإنه لا عذر له بالجهل, because they don't have an excuse with ignorance, right? This is a nuanced issue in our times, that okay, so in general there's a principle that al-udhru, al-jahlu لا يقبل عذرا في الأحكام. Right? الجهل لا يقبل عذرا. Right? Right? Ignorance is not accepted excuse. If you drive, so well, I have a right to drive, okay, but you have a responsibility to know the laws, right? We intuit that in everything. You got a job, they didn't tell you everything, so you walked into the director's office and went into his drawer and had his premium, temperature controlled chocolates. The door was open, right? Because nobody dares go in there, right? So I didn't know. It's not accepted as an excuse. Why? Because ignorance is not generally accepted as an excuse, unless they are extenuating circumstances, right? So one could either, if in a Muslim land, both Muslim and non-Muslim are generally considered to be aware of the general prescriptions, right? Because even if you ask the common Canadian, who certainly in a large city, that okay, do Muslims fast? They probably, a large percentage of people would have a sense, right? So a fortiori in a Muslim land, right? It's not typically accepted that someone would enter Islam and not know that they were obligated to fast, right? In a non-Muslim land, what's meant by Dar al-Harb, of course, is a place where Muslims are not recognized as well, right? So Dar al-Harb, the characteristics of Dar al-Harb are this: it's not just a non-Muslim land, but the presumption is that you're in a place where where Islam is alien and there aren't Muslims around, right? Someone became Muslim in that kind of situation, then it's conceivable that they didn't know, right? So how does one reduce this down to a rigorous principle? The ulama are reluctant to come up with general principles, because if you lay down a dabit, a overarching criteria, then it can be applied to all kinds of rules, and situations are sensitive, right? So broadly, in our time, someone becomes Muslim, it's hard to conceive of the fact that they didn't know that they had to fast, right? There may be details that may be ignored with respect to the validity of their fasting, right? So they didn't know, they didn't yet get a chance to learn that, or they were taught incorrectly, then ignorance may be accepted as an excuse for a new Muslim with respect to details. Generally, it is hard to see that someone would not know about the obligation of fasting itself. The details are easier. For example, I have a friend, actually his children attend Seekers. When he became Muslim, he was told that you fast from sunrise to sunset. And someone told him that. So he fasted the whole month of Ramadan alone, serenely. I believe it was in southern Spain or somewhere at that time. I forget exactly where. He'd pray Fajr, then have a nice breakfast, and look towards the horizon, wait for sunrise, and eat till then. And he didn't have access. This is over 20 years ago. He didn't have access to internet or this or that or circumstance. So if an issue like that arises, one should take it to a discerning mufti, that these are the circumstances that arise, right? So it be in a place where there aren't Muslims, one doesn't have ready access to Muslims, it's not known that there's mosques there, etc., a community, and they themselves, in their particular circumstances, did not have access to finding out what Islam entails, right? Allahu A'lam. Okay. But that, of course, highlights the communal obligation the fard kifai of facilitating reliable, basic religious education, the al-fard al-aini, the personal obligation, al-asasi, the absolute fundamental. Someone became Muslim, how can they learn the absolute basics of the religion in absolute minimum time, right? With clarity and beauty and so on, right? وَيُشْتَرَطُ لِوُجُوبِ أَدَائِهِ, and it's a condition for, so these are the 4 conditions for it being obligatory to fast, broadly, right? That only such a person is obligated to fast. But then there are, so someone may be obligated to fast, but then there are conditions for the obligation of performing the fast. And why? Like this, and we'll see. Because the sick person is obligated to fast, but they're not obligated to perform that fast. Right? So let's say they enter Ramadan sick. Were they obligated to fast? Day 1, yes. Day 2, day 3, day 4, day 5, they're obligated to fast, but they're not obligated to perform the fast on that day. Right? So that's why they have to make up those days. Right? That's why they distinguish between the general conditions for obligation and then the conditions for it being obligatory to perform a particular day of fasting. Because if, for example, someone entered the month non-Muslim and they became Muslim on day 3, they only became obligated to fast day 3, right? The conditions of obligation, their nature is that once you get them, you can't go back on them, right? Which is why, like the ahkam of the murtad are not accepted, because you don't want to open the door for people saying, you know what, it's Ramadan, I'm not Muslim. Wal-'iyadhu billah. Right? Because common people have simple thinking, and you don't want to give people the rope to hurt themselves, right? فلا يصدق. ويشترط لوجوب أدائه الذي هو عبارة عن تفريغ الذمة في وقته. The condition for the obligation of the current performance of the fast, of fasting a particular day, and this idea of ada is an important concept, right? That when there is a command, there are 2 levels of fulfillment of a command that is related to time. There's an ada, so there's a command, there's an amr, right? And the command then has either a current performance, which is al-ityanu bil-ma'mur fi waqtihi, is to fulfill what was commanded in its time, right? And qada, which is al-ityanu bil-ma'mur ba'da waqtihi. And qada, a make-up, is doing what was commanded, but after its commanded time. And what does it do? So he says that an ada, a current performance, is عبارة عن تفريغ الذمة في وقته. It's to clear one's dues within the time. Right? الذمة, right? The dhimma is your dues, right? And it's related to the idea of them, that which, if not fulfilled, makes you susceptible to blame, right? It's due upon you. If you didn't fulfill it, you're and there's other explanations for dhimma, but they say a dhimmatu, your dues, wi'a'un i'tibari. It is a it is an effective container, so to speak. Receptacle or whatever, right? Effective container. تدخل فيه الحقوق, right? In which rights enter. فلا تخرج إلا بأداء أو قضاء أو إبراء. And they don't leave your dues unless you fulfill them in their time, that's ada, or you fulfill them after their time, which is qada, or if there's ibra, if waived by the person who made you responsible for them, right? So you owe someone $1,000, you go ask them, could I be excused of this? And they say, sure, then it was waived of you. Right? Okay. So what are these shurut of wujub al-ada? He says, الصحة من مرض, being free of sickness. Right? لقوله تعالى فمن كان منكم مريضا, right? From Surah Al-Baqarah verse 184. So whoever of you is sick. And he'll describe what is the threshold of sickness that permits not fasting when we look at the awarid as-sawm, right? The excuses from fasting. Al-ayah, the rest of the verse, because Allah says, فَعِدَّةٌ مِّنْ أَيَّامٍ أُخَرٍ, then fast a number of like days. Right? أو على سفر فعدة من أيام أخر. If sick or traveling, then perform a like number of days after it. Right? And broadly, al-marad is that's mubih, is the one that from which there's undue hardship. Right? There's slight hardship, you feel a little thirsty, a little tired, etc. Undue hardship is that which is not customarily considered bearable, or that would entail reasonable fear of harm or sickness or aggravation of condition. Right? والصحة أي الخلو عن حيض ونفاس, and to be free of menstruation or postnatal bleeding. لما قدمناه, because of what we mentioned before, right? Because they're exempt from fasting. Insofar as they fulfill the conditions of the fast being obligatory, but they're exempted from the current performance, right? So they have to make it up. والإقامة, and being resident. لما تلوناه, right? Because of what we have related. Being resident. So the traveler is not obligated to fast that day. Right? They're obligated to fast. So each day that enter the sabab of wujub, right? So imagine if there's a conveyor belt of believers, right? Each person has their dhimma, their wi'a. This container comes. If the condition for obligation is there, they're allotted that, okay, this needs to go into your dues. Right? So you're allocated, okay, you are responsible to fast for this day. But are you obligated to fast that particular day? That's this wujubul ada. And no. So these people, the sick person, the menstruating, the woman in her period, or postnatal bleeding, or the person who is traveling, they're allotted that yes, you have an obligation to fast for this day, but do you have to fast that actual day? No. So then they're allowed to make it up. They're allowed to make it up. And there are conditions for the traveler, and we'll see them, that you need to be a traveler at the time when Fajr comes in. And we'll see that when we get to it. وَيُشْتَرَطُ لِصِحَّةِ أَدَائِهِ. It's a condition for it to be valid, for your fasting to be valid, أي فعله ليكون أعم من الأداء والقضاء. Right? It's a condition for the validity of its current performance. And by current performance here, he means making the fast, fi'l, right? So that the expression is more general than ada and qada. Now, you could say the commentator is the same as the author of the matan. Why doesn't he just change it? Because he authored the matan much earlier on its own. Then he wrote a large commentary on it. Then he abridged the commentary. But from the time he authored it, the text became widespread. So it wasn't an option to do these kinds of edits, right? But also that ada has the meaning of adda is to fulfill. Really? And qada has a meaning of discharging what is already due upon you, right? So they say yes, that in usul they tell us that in terms of fulfilling the command, that ada, a current performance, and a qada, and a make-up are discharged with either term. Okay? So someone stands up to pray dhuhr and they say, nawaitu qada al-dhuhr. I intend to discharge the duty of dhuhr. That counts as a current performance. Right? And if someone stands up and intends nawaitu an uaddiya dhuhr al-ams, I intend to make up, to do ada, to perform yesterday's dhuhr, right? Ada, that is also, so you can use ada, perform, current performance, for qada, and you can use the term qada, discharge, for what by default is used for making up what was missed. You can also use it for a current performance, right? And you can find the expression if you want to look it up in the Manar, right? Al-ada wal-qada. Because so the matan is the text, the expression here is not wrong, but it could be more, more clear. ثلاثة. So there's three conditions for valid current performance, and let's read them first. النية والخلو عما ينافيه من حيض ونفاس وعما يفسده. Right? The three conditions for valid performance are the intention, and to be free of that which negates it, such as hayd, such as menstruation and postnatal bleeding, wa amma yufsiduhu, and to be free of that which invalidates it, right? Of the invalidators of fasting, eating, drinking, or fulfillment of sexual desire, in particular ways that are coming up. So he says, ويشترط لصحة أدائه أي فعله ليكون أعم من الأداء والقضاء. We read that. ثلاثة شرائط النية في وقتها لكل يوم. Intention in its time for each day. In its time, i.e. in the time that is valid for fasting for each particular day. Right? In its time, so with respect to the current performance, and he kept it general, because we will see in an upcoming section that the fasts with respect to intention fall under various categories. So for the current performance of Ramadan, the time of intention, as Tahtawi tells us, is from when Maghrib enters to just before the midday. So if you can make the intention at any time from Maghrib time until the midday. And the midday is halfway between dawn and sunset. Right? So it's called al-Dahwa al-Kubra. Now, the caution, unless someone is sick or so on, is as soon as you break the fast, you intend to fast the next day. Many of the righteous and many of the ulama would encourage people that when you make the dua of fasting, Allahumma laka sumt wa bika amantu ala rizqika aftart, they would just add to it wa ala sawmil ghad nawait lillahi ta'ala, right? And that you just add to it that I intend to fast the next day for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that's from caution. It's not just from caution, it's also from reward that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and His Messenger have taught us to be conscious of the reality of sleep as being the lesser death. Right? So you don't know if you're going to catch the next day, but if you intended in advance, you have the reward for it, even if you didn't live for the next day, or even if, for example, you fell ill. You're not missing out because you already intended it. Right? Okay. ولا يشترط لصحة what do you have لصحة what do you have in the commentary? Okay. Sorry. النية, والخلو عما ينافيه, and to be free of that which negates it, ينافي صحة فعله, i.e. negates valid performance of the fast. Right? من حيض ونفاس, such as menstruation and postnatal bleeding, لمنافاتهما, because these negate the fast. Right? والخلو عما يفسده, and to be free of that which invalidates it, بطروه عليه, if they overcome. ولا يشترط لصحة الخلو عن الجنابة. Right? And it's not a condition for the validity of the fast that one be free of major ritual impurity, meaning that which requires ghusl. لقدرته على الإزالة, because one is fit to remove it, to lift it. You just have to make ghusl. Right? Whereas you cannot lift your menstruation or postnatal bleeding. Right? وضرورة حصولها ليلا, and out of the practical necessity that these things happen at night, وطروء النهار, and day overcomes one. Right? So someone went to sleep in a state of janaba and they woke up and it's Fajr time. Right? This is likely to happen, and also because this is established from prophetic practice and teachings as well. Right? Right? As has been related from the wives of the Prophet ﷺ on occasion, that Fajr entered with him requiring ghusl ﷺ. ولا يشترط الخلو من الجنابة. Okay. وليس العقل والإقامة من شروط الصحة. Sanity and residence are not from the conditions of validity. Right? فإن الجنون إذا طرأ وبقي إلى الغروب صح صومه. Because نسأل الله العافية, may Allah grant us wellness. If insanity overcomes someone and it remains till sunset, their fast is valid. Because there are two levels of there are, with respect to mental capacity, people are at various levels. There's three broad categories. Firstly, there's al-aqil, there's the one who is sane, i.e. the one who has full mental capacity. And then you have al-majnoon, the one who is insane, i.e. the one who's fundamentally lacking mental capacity. So they're, basically, they don't have basic sound discernment. Right? They can't distinguish between obvious benefit and harm. They wouldn't know how to cross the road. That's majnoon. Right? They have loss of sanity. And they define it, that'll take us outside the parameters of what we're talking about. And the third category is what's called al-ma'tuh, or in the States called al-atah. And that's someone of diminished mental capacity. But then junoon, insanity, is of two types. Al-junoon al-mutbiq and al-junoon al-ghayr al-mutbiq. You have lasting mental incapacity, lasting insanity, and you have temporary insanity. And there's a range of opinions about this. It is a matter of ijtihad. But the fatwa position broadly is that lasting insanity, al-junoon al-mutbiq, the fatwa is that it's 30 days. And there's implications. Right? There's implications. Because if you review carefully, and that's why we always urge you to diagram these things, take notes, etc., is that someone who is insane the whole month of Ramadan, what happens? They did not witness any part of the month such that the divine address to fast that month would relate to them. So they don't have to make up anything. But somebody who was sane during the month, but who had fluctuating mental capacity, would be morally responsible to fast those days. But they don't fulfill the condition of. So that's why al-aql, before, in the asbab al-wujub, that refers to ben la yakuna majnunan jununan mutbiqan, that one is not insane with lasting insanity. Because fluctuating insanity we'll look at in a moment. Now, if any day comes and they don't have sanity when the day begins, they don't have to fast during that day. Rather, they would make it up later. But if someone entered the day in a state of sanity and they had temporary loss of sanity, etc., their fast remains valid. That could well be, if they have to take medication, whatever, then they're considered to have sickness as well. They could break their fast. But someone, let's say, they have care, or they know how, they're aware of what they need to do in that circumstance. So they have temporary loss of sanity. They go, sit down and they rest, whatever, and they're able to finish the fast. That fast is valid, and that's rahmah bihim, right? And the basis of the rulings related to both the ma'tuh, the one lacking mental capacity, and the majnoon is there's rahmah and ikram, is mercy and honoring. Why? Because these are special servants of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? If you see someone who is majnoon, right, who lacks mental capacity, you are looking at a person of paradise. That if they remain like this, there is guarantee from Allah, these are from the people of paradise. Right? So that's why, in religious culture, and practice fluctuates, but these are people who are treated with honor. They're let be. They're let be. Right? And I used to find it kind of strange. There'd be people walking around Damascus, and people would respect them, would seat them down, give them tea, this and that, and just let them be. And they'd come to the masjid and do the darndest things and so on. I'd be like, this is so annoying. It's so distracting. But people say, khalihi, just let them be. Right? Bismillah. And then he says, وَرُكْنُهُ, right? The integral of fasting, أي الصيام, الكف أي الإمساك عن قضاء شهوتي البطن والفرج وعما ألحق بهما, is to refrain from fulfilling the desires of the stomach by not eating and drinking, and the desires of one's private parts, and from that which is considered akin to these things that we will be detailing. Right? And then he tells us, وَحُكْمُهُ, what is the ruling of the fast? سقوط الواجب أي اللازم فرضا كان أو غيره, that it fulfills the duty. Wajib here means the duty. It's either intrinsically a duty, by it being fard or wajib, by it being legally obligatory or necessary, or it's a duty بإيجاب العبد لأن الشروع ملزم, because beginning something makes it incumbent to finish. Right? لوجوب قضاء ما أفسده من نفل, because it is wajib to make up something that you a nafil that you yourself invalidated. Okay. عن الذمة, right? سقوط الواجب عن الذمة, the lifting of the obligation from one's dues. بإيجاب الله تعالى أو العبد, by the obligating of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? The fard and the wajib, أو العبد, or the servant, which is the duty to fulfill, to complete the nafil that you began, or make it up. So the nafil, the voluntary act, enters one's dhimma as a duty in a distinct manner, because the nafil, you didn't have to do it, but once you chose to do it, and it's an act of devotion, right? And so it, because what does ibadah express? Right? And there's a legal basis, but amongst the hikmahs of this that they mentioned, the ibadah. Right? Why do you have, this applies to the prayer as well. If you began a prayer, you must, and you break it, it's wajib to make it up. Is the ibadah is an expression of ta'zeem al-ma'bud, of venerating the one worshipped. Now, there's an obligatory veneration. But once you took it upon yourself to engage in this act of venerating the one worshipped, then you can't just leave it. You need to fulfill it. Because not fulfilling it is munafi لمعنى التعظيم, because it goes against the meaning of ta'zim, الذي هو واجب, which is required. And there's many other ways that this is explained. Okay. So حكمه سقوط الواجب, number one. Right? The ruling is that it lifts the wajib. والثواب تكرما من الله, as an honor and a gift from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, في الآخرة, in the hereafter. إن لم يكن منهيا عنه, if it is not prohibited. فإن كان منهيا عنه كصوم النحر, in أيام النحر, فحكمه الصحة والخروج عن العهدة, unless it's prohibited. Now, if the fasts are prohibited, such as fasting the days of Eid, its ruling is that the fast will be valid and sinful, but the fast that one began leaves one's dues. وَالْإِثْمِ بِالْإِعْرَاضِ عَنْ ضِيَافَةِ اللَّهِ, but you'll be sinful for turning away from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's ضِيَافَة, from his feast, right? Because we are commanded to celebrate those days, right? And then he tells us about some of the wisdoms of the obligation of the fast. So he tells us, rahimahullah ta'ala, وَحِكْمَةُ مَشْرُوعِيَّةِ الصَّوْمِ minha, from the wisdoms of the legislation of fasting, from it, and this is so he's pointing to the fact that there's a lot more, there's an implicit kathira, right? But Imam Tahtawi says it would have been better to mention it explicitly, right? It's more lexically direct. Right? Minha, so amongst them, and we know with the month of fasting a month away, it's good to start preparing to read the related hadiths. We have a number of courses on Seekers on the virtues of fasting, etc. And these are things that one prepares for, right? So we're looking at the legal rulings, but that's where, in any chapter of fiqh, the talib ilm and seeking knowledge is like the student of knowledge, it's like a craft, right? That one keeps honing it, right? One keeps honing it. Being a believer is like a craft, because why? Because you are presenting your acts of worship to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So you're striving to, what is ihsan, right? إن الله يحب إذا عمل أحدكم عملا أن يحسنه. أحسن is the striving to do something with completeness and with perfection, right? So in that, things like making coffee, for example, or these kinds of things, you find the ulama pay attention to these things, or in the old days they used to, a lot of ulama used to pay attention to, for example, these matters of process, right? Like cutting their pen, right? They had reed pens, or you find some ulama would use fountain pens when they came, and choosing the right ink in the right way. All these kinds of things. Right? Why? Because it's a reminder of this idea of ihsan. And part of ihsan is to review. And there's outward ihsan and an inward ihsan. So how does one cultivate ihsan in this? There are, one reviews what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us in the Quran about fasting, and what the beloved Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam tells us about fasting. Right? So the one should have a toolkit each year, of reviewing what's in the Quran and in the Sunnah of our beloved Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam regarding fasting. In this, there's a beautiful work by Sheikh Hassan al-Mashaq, who's a great scholar of the Hijaz of the 20th century. And we covered it at the first hub. I don't know if we have it on the YouTube channel. We'll share the PDF, inshallah. The same work was taught by Habib Omar in Arabic a couple of years ago. And that contains a lot of the key, the key verses related to fasting, and explains them, and also some of the key hadiths of the Prophet ﷺ related to Ramadan and fasting and its virtues, etc. This is something that one would refer to, things like Riyadus Salihin, and these are manuals for every believer, right? Riyadus Salihin, At-Targhib wa Tarhib, right, of Imam al-Munziri, which is a jewel of a book. It's called Is'afu Ahl al-Iman بوظائف شهر رمضان. إسعاف أهل الإيمان بوظائف شهر رمضان. Right? Sheikh Hassan al-Mashat. And so I've shared this PDF, inshallah, Is'af Ahl al-Iman. It's not a short work, but it's certainly not a long work. And it's written in an easy way and so on. But it's comprehensive. Even if, so he has the text, right, and commentary on it, right? The text is actually quite brief, right, because he has the Quranic verses and the hadiths, and he comments upon them. So at least to cover the text itself is very useful, right? So Riyadh al-Salihin and then there is the spiritual side, right? The spiritual dimensions of fasting, right? Which is Asrar al-Sawm, right? We have from the Ihya of Imam al-Ghazali, this inner dimensions of fasting, that's there. You have Imam al-Haddad's Book of Assistance, right? Which is amazing. You have also Imam al-Haddad's own, or what's called al-Nasih, what's it called? Al-Nasaih al-Diniyya, Religious Counsels, right, which is also available in English, right? You also have there's many resources like that on the inward dimensions of fasting. You have, for example, Ibn Ajiba in Arabic. This is not available in English. Ibn Ajiba in his Tafsir al-Fatiha al-Kabir, he has a beautiful section on fasting. You have, and it's available in English, Kashf al-Mahjub of al-Hujwiri, who's the patron saint of Lahore, famous in the subcontinent as Data Ganj Baksh. His Kashf al-Mahjub, which has multiple translations into English. The section on fasting is amazing. And other works by contemporary scholars and others to look at the inward dimensions of fasting, because everybody has written, not every, the commentaries in the hadith bring out numerous meanings regarding this. There's a beautiful work, which is one of Imam Zayd's favorite works, seen him holding it all the time. It's called Lata'if al-Ma'arif. Lata'if al-Ma'arif of Ibn Rajab al-Hanbali, which is a work on what has come on the virtues and duties of all the months of the year, and has amazing sections on Ramadan, etc. It's one of the works that the ulama highly praise and commend. There's a shorter work by Sheikh Yusuf Khattar, who's one of the teachers who teaches with Seekers Guidance Arabiya. It's a shorter work on the duties of the months, and it touches upon the month of Ramadan as well. So this is something that one dips into because one wants to connect one's proper legal fasting to the divine command and understanding the command of Allah and the guidance of His Messenger with increasing depth and nuance as part of our commitment to excellence, but also to look at what have the ulama understood of the meanings of fasting, because the root meaning of the fast is refraining, right? Is refraining. Now this refraining has a basic legal level. So in Arabic, Sama is amsaka or kaffa. Fasting is one refrained. The legal command is just a basic refraining, which is what we do, right? But the fullness of the fast is much more than that, right? Is much more than that. And that's what they touch upon and expand upon and help us realize. There's also, of course, a luma of Abu Nasr, Abi Nasr, al-Sirraj, right? One of the early works of Islamic spirituality, has a spectacular section on fasting and many other places, right? So this is an area that we can expand upon and benefit. So we will finish this section today. So he says, وَحِكْمَةُ مَشْرُوعِيَّةِ الصَّوْمِ minha, from the wisdoms of the legislation of fasting is, right, indicating that there are many more. These are some of them, right? So he says, أَنَّ بِهِ سُكُونُ النَّفْسِ الْأَمَّارَةِ, that through it does one bring one's lower self that is ever commanding to evil to rest, right? Because what are the muharrikatun nafs? What stirs the nafs that commands to evil? What stirs it is? What stirs it? It's one's desires. And the basic desires are food, are the desires of the stomach and the desires of the flesh, of the private parts, right? Right? And it trains to restrain it from other things. بإعراضها عن الفضول, by making it turn away from excess. فضول is ما لا فائدة منه, right? الزيادة التي لا فائدة منه, from the extra that has no benefit, right? But rather has harm, right? لأنها إذا جاعت شبعت جميع الأعضاء فتنقبض اليد والرجل والعين وباقي الجوارح عن حركاتها. Because when it hungers, شبعت it, because when the lower self hungers, it causes all the limbs to restrain. So the hand desists, and the legs desist, and the eyes desist, and all the limbs desist from their harakatiha, from their movements, meaning from their fudul, from their excess, right? That is the wisdom, if pursued in accordance with the sunnah. Harakatiha ay sayyi'ah, right? From their excess, right? Right? وإذا right? وإذا شبعت النفس جاعت الجوارح بمعنى قوية. And if the lower self is satiated, has its fill, then the limbs will become hungry, meaning they will gain appetite. على البطش والنظر, to go forth and to look, وفعل ما لا ينبغي, and to do that which does not befit. فبانقباضها يصفو القلب. So by constraining the lower self, does one purify the heart, right? How? By صفاء is الخلو عن الكدورات, right? Because purity is to be free of impurities. How do impurities creep into your heart? By the excess of what your limbs do. So one needs to bring a quietude to your limbs. And the fasting does that. By hunger, you restrain the basic urges of the lower self, right? And that state of restraint restrains the limbs. But by giving in to everything that your lower self wants, of its these fundamental desires, then the limbs go out of control. And they bring in qadar. They bring in dross. Whether the basic dross is ghafla, is heedlessness. And then blameworthy things. But heedlessness hurts in your relationship with Allah. Blameworthy things, distractions, the dislike, busies you from Allah. Sins distance you away from Allah. So it's not just, one sort of just, you're off the straight path, kind of lounging around. But you're still, you're on the side. You're not walking the straight path. Heedlessness, distraction. Distraction's kind of like you're now headed in a more dangerous direction, but you're still on the off road. But a sin, you walk away from the straight path, right? And dhulm is you took another road. وَتَحْصُلُ الْمُرَاقَبَةِ, and through this restraint, one attains, or meaning one in potential attains vigilance, muraqabah, right? Right? This consciousness that Allah is watching me, and this consciousness of أَلَمْ يَعْلَمْ بِأَنَّ اللَّهَ يَرَهُ, do they not know that Allah beholds them? وَمِنْهَا الْعَطْفُ عَلَى الْمَسَاكِينَ, and from the benefits of fasting is to grow in concern, and atf is the expression of mercy, right? The heart of the meaning of mercy is care and concern expressed on the needy. بِالْإِحْسَاسِ بِأَلَمِ الْجُوعِ, by feeling the pain of hunger. لِمَنْ هُوَ وَصْفُهُ أَبَدًا, especially for those who are always experiencing hunger. فَيُحْسِنُ إِلَيْهِ, so one does good to them, right? لِلَّهِ تَعَالَى إِنَّمَا نُطْعِمُكُمْ لِوَجْهِ اللَّهِ, right? For the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وَلِذَا, and this is why لَا يَنْبَغِي الْإِفْرَاطُ فِي السَّحُورِ, this is why it is not befitting that one be excessive in one's pre-dawn meal, sahur. لِمَنْعِهِ الْحِكْمَةِ, because it prevents or weakens the wisdom al-maqsuda, that is sought. And there's a spiritual wisdom of fasting and a social wisdom of fasting. And likewise, of course, with the sahur and wal iftar, and likewise with the iftar, it's meant to be restrained. Otherwise, it vitiates some or much of the purpose. And if you end up eating more and more fancy in Ramadan than other months, then could even be counterproductive. If Ramadan is the month of feasting, that is not the month of fasting, right? And yeah, there's a feasting insofar as people gather, one may eat certain nice things, etc., but not to shed the garment of restraint. And of course, another resource that is spectacular on this, and there's so many, right? But just these come to mind is al-Uhud al-Muhammadiyya, right? Of Ash-Sha'rani, right? Which has amazing sections on the wisdoms of fasting, etc. Right? And another of the benefits is وَالِاتِّصَافِ بِصِفَةِ الْمَلَائِكَةِ, and characterizing oneself with the characteristics of the angels. Why? Because they don't eat nor drink, and they are the devoted servants of God, right? وَلَا يَدْخُلُ الرِّيَاء فِي الصَّوْمِ الْفَرْضِ. And then he mentions a closing thing, that showing off does not enter in the obligatory fast, يعني أي من حيث الصحة, in terms of its validity, right? And here Imam al-Tahtawi summarizes the issue of showing off. Like if one fasted out of showing off, it still counts as a fast of Ramadan. And right, so that's the section on fasting. And the we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to bless us in our fasting and enable us to fulfill the aims of fasting and the aims of the month of Ramadan, and to make us realize those meanings throughout the year and in all our actions. وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على سيدنا ونبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما كثيرا والحمد لله رب العالمين.
There's a question. Can one intend to fast the entire month of Ramadan at the beginning of the month, or is there a requirement that one makes the intention?
Yeah. So, can one intend to fast the entire month of Ramadan at the beginning of the month? Yeah, actually the ulama mentioned that this is good to do. One, for the idea that actions are by intention. Someone were to die before fasting the whole month, they had made an explicit intention to fast the whole month, right? And Allah is more generous than to let you down with something like that. That's one benefit of making the intention of fasting the whole month. The other benefit of making the intention of fasting the whole month is that this is valid according to some of the imams, from the Malikis, for example. But in the Hanafi school, one needs to intend each day. But the basic intention is almost inevitable, right? The basic intention is almost inevitable, right? It's inconceivable that a Muslim in Ramadan, a Muslim who fasts, would not have intended that day, right? Because the sign of the intention, as we see in the section on the in the rules of prayer, what is the intention of fasting? The sign of it is that you would know intuitively what you're doing, such that if you're asked, what are you doing today? So, I'm fasting. That's the intention. The fast is not some convoluted set of things that one does, right? It is the resolve. Like, why are you not eating and drinking? I'm fasting, right? So it's almost inconceivable not to have the basic intention. But what we're talking about is to have, when we talk about intention in fasting, is to have a high intention, right? And amongst the things that one includes one's intention, one should have in mind some of the wisdoms of fasting. Right? I'm fasting Ramadan, or I'm fasting Thursday for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to follow the sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and with these wisdoms. And there's a spiritual quality of gratitude and mindfulness and veneration and etc. Okay, then next we will see the different types of fast, that there's 6. So we'll pause there. وصلى الله على نبينا محمد وآله والحمد لله رب العالمين.
Zain was asking about what was the Ma'ayal and where can they read what they can find it.
Okay, we'll address that separately, inshallah.
The question from Sidi Hamza on the position of Islam from the conditions of obligation of Ramadan. Imam Bukhari mentions that al-Aslah and al-Kuffar مخاطبون بفروع الشريعة فيعذبون على كونها عذابا
Okay,
شديدا
okay.
على عذاب.
So what's the question?
Is this the Aslah or the more cautious? Does this position entail qada for converts?
No, it doesn't entail anything. There's agreement that in terms of, with respect to non-Muslims and the rulings of Sharia, there's agreement that there's no outward worldly call for them to do these things. Because the condition for the validity of these things is Islam. But then, and therefore, there's consensus that someone who becomes Muslim does not need to make up what they didn't do before becoming Muslim. Islam يجبر ما قبله. Islam covers for all that came before. Right? So there's no expectation. Rather, deeming that a religious expectation or praiseworthy would be considered a bid'ah. Right? Would be considered a bid'ah. Right? As a religious expectation. Right? There are some scholars of the spiritual path, etc., who do it, but that's, if someone made a spiritual commitment, that's spiritual trading, that's a separate thing. But as a religious duty, for that to be expected, to be any expectation, is it's a bid'ah shani'ah, it's a distant bid'ah. But of course, you have to be aware, there are some of the scholars of spiritual path someone took the path, they would tell their students to do different kinds of spiritual exercises, and that's spiritual training. The Prophet ﷺ prayed half or more of the night, or less. We're not commanded to do that, right? There's a element of spiritual training and spiritual works, that's a separate matter, right? And that door is open, right? But the main aspect of the question is that are they held to account in the hereafter both for disbelief and for faith and practice, or only for non-faith? Right? And there's a difference about that, and ultimately, that's an issue discussed in usul al-fiqh, etc., but has no practical considerations for us, insofar as on the Day of Judgment, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not going to consult us. And when in usul al-fiqh, you see, there are texts that indicate this position, and there's texts that indicate the other. مَا سَلَكَكُمْ فِي سَقَرٍ? What caused you to descend into saqar? قالوا لم نكن من المصلين. We were not of those who prayed. ولم نكن, and we did not feed the indigent. وكنا نخوض مع الخائضين. Right? And we used to engage in blameworthy talk with those who engage in blameworthy talk. And other such texts. But the other response is, لَمْ نَكُ مِنَ الْمُصَلِّينَ. We were not of those who believed and therefore prayed. So there is iqtida'un nas there. There is something necessarily implicit in the text, and the punishment revolves around what is implicit, not its expressions. Therefore, meaning we are not of the believers who pray and do this and do this and do that. So we did not have faith itself, and therefore we didn't have good deeds. And there's back and forth. That's way outside the scope. There,